Rise up!
This is the Rise Up See Red podcast, all about the Arizona Cardinals and the NFL, featuring insider and outsider perspectives. Enjoy the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. Now here are your hosts, Jess Root and Seth Cox.
Hello, Arizona Cardinals fans, and welcome to the latest edition of the Rise Up See Red podcast. This is your host, Jess Root from CardsWire.com, the USA Today NFL Wire site covering your Arizona Cardinals. And as always, I've got Seth Cox from RevengeOfTheBirds.com, SB Nation's Arizona Cardinals site. And this is episode 295. This is the first of our 2020 off-season shows. I guess technically it's the 2021 off-season. The Cardinal season ended in Week 17 with their loss to the Rams as we closed out the season last week with our show, our end-of-season show, and we begin our off-season series of shows. Seth, how was playoff weekend not having to do any Cardinals work? I mean, bittersweet. It's, for me, bittersweet, as always, because it's work, but dadgummit, wouldn't it have been nice to have the Cardinals there?
Yeah, it would have been nice. I mean, obviously, it makes the weekend for us easier. But, I mean, we would rather be out there and you know, enjoying watching the Cardinals, win or lose, continue to play. It always, you know, sucks when the season's over and when you're basically done. And so to not see them out there, I mean, maybe they get run off the field by the Seahawks, but I think they could have had a competitive game that really gave them a chance to win in advance. But I will say this, after this weekend, you have to feel a lot better about the butt kicking they got the week before.
Yeah, right. There's that. And we're going to talk about that with what's coming up is in our show. But the one thing that I lament is you look at the fact how the Bears played against the Saints. Had the Cardinals picked up one stupid win they should have won, that would have been them in the 7th seed, and then they could have gotten their butts kicked by the Saints. But had they been able to beat the Rams, then they would have been the ones playing Seattle, and Seattle looked very beatable. So we're actually going to talk a little bit about the playoffs. We won't get super in depth. We'll give our thoughts, our impressions of what we saw from the playoffs in the first round of the wild card games. We're going to talk about it, and then we're going to jump right into the off-season things. The biggest off-season questions. There have been some reported coaching moves on the Cardinals staff. We'll talk about the biggest needs and then a little bit of the guys that they have signed to futures deals and then a little bit from the national championship game. We won't get big into free agency or the Cardinals' individual free agents yet. We feel that that's basically a show in and of itself. We don't want to make this a 3-hour show. We got to spread out the content pretty much. So let's go ahead and get started, Seth. Let's talk about initial reactions to what you saw over Wild Card Weekend. What did you take away from the weekend?
I think it was. Well, I always kind of try to look at everything from a Arizona Cardinals perspective, and the first thing I took away is that the Cardinals are not as close as we had hoped from a talent perspective. And I think that was obvious the second half of the season when DeAndre Hopkins started to slow down a little bit in his production because of, you know, how teams were covering him and making sure he wasn't the guy that beat them. But you look at the teams that won and, you know, you look at the Bills and Stephon Diggs is obviously phenomenal. He beat out, Hopkins for one of the all-pro spots. But in that game, they were able to really, spread the ball around. They had a lot of different guys affect the game in a positive manner. You had obviously Diggs with 128 yards, but you had Gabriel Davis with 85 yards. You had Cole Beasley with 57 yards and 7 catches. When you're able to kind of spread the ball around, and that makes a huge difference. You look at the Saints, and you look at their defense, and we've talked a lot about the Cardinals maybe lacking in just kind of health in that department, but you look at their starting defense, and who plays on their defense in terms of snaps, and I mean, Malcolm Jenkins is older. And by the way, I know the Bears offense stinks, so but Malcolm Jenkins is older. Cam Jordan is a good player, but he's not the Cam Jordan he was um, a couple years ago. He's in his what now? He's 30, almost 32. Yeah, Chandler product, by the way. So, um, you look at it, and he's not quite the guy he was, but their scheme and their athleticism puts them in a position to be successful. And again, I get it was the Bears, so take it with a grain of salt. But you look at the Browns win. You've got the idea of a team that has really kind of scraped and clawed to get to where they are, and then put it all together, and they do it in a bevy of ways. Obviously, Pittsburgh shot themselves in the foot quite a bit, but the Browns, have taken their time getting their team to the right mixture of players and coaches, and finding the right guys. And I think that's a big part of the deal. And it's kind of funny because their offense really took off when maybe their single best player, Odell Beckham Jr., went down. Tampa Bay is not a team I don't think you can really look at, because Tom Brady is just, obviously a different guy than anybody else in the league. But that Washington team, you look at it, they've got 4 first-round picks on their defensive line. They don't have much talent on offense, but their defense does enough to keep them in games, and their offensive line's not bad either. And then Baltimore, before we get to the NFC West face-off, Baltimore, you see a team that has continued to find a way to be physical, to reload on the defensive side of the ball. I mean, you look at their defensive front, and they're made up of mostly guys that they've brought in off the street. I mean, Derek Wolfe, Calais Campbell, and the guys that they, Yannick Ngakoue, and the guys that they've drafted have been on day 2 and 3. So again, you're talking about a philosophy that's there more than anything else. And I think that's one of the things that, when you look at it from the Cardinals perspective, you say, and you and I've talked about this quite a bit. What is the philosophy? What is this team's philosophical backbone from a football perspective? Because they haven't been an air raid team. They were running the ball extremely well last year. In the first half of the season, when Kyler Murray was healthy, they ran the ball extremely well. But as soon as Kyler got hurt and wasn't able to run, they became a team that didn't know how to run the football, or at least run it efficiently. Defensively, it seemed, and I don't want this to come across as Vance Joseph bashing, but they don't have a ton of talent that was healthy by the end of the season. And the talent that they did have didn't seem to mesh well together. Isaiah Simmons still wasn't playing a ton of snaps. Byron Murphy's snap counts were, would ebb and flow. I mean, those are the young guys. Obviously, Jalen Thompson was injured for most of the season, so you give that a pass. But outside of Budda Baker, who was the young guy that they kind of brought along and developed this year defensively? And that's the thing. It doesn't feel like they did that. And so when you look at it from, a Cardinals-centric point of view, I didn't get that. It just seems like the Cardinals, from a philosophical standpoint, aren't close to a lot of these teams in who they are and what they want to be.
Maybe. The one thing that I took away from that is that had they somehow been able to beat the Rams, that, man, they'd been playing Seattle, and Seattle looked pretty beatable. But I will say that, oh my gosh, what was with the Rams? Because that defense looks championship capable, and how they end up falling apart there, and how they lose to the Jets, like how. I get how Seattle beat them because Seattle somehow does that. But then in the playoffs, to just really take control of everything and do that with, it's almost like, what it kind of feels like. Well, one, the defense took the Brandon Staley took that defense took it a level up after Wade Phillips left, but then offensively, it's like Sean McVay. When, and I guess for some reason, maybe that Doug Peterson thing a couple years ago when they won the Super Bowl, and Doug Peterson had to kind of change how he did things because of Nick Foles. When McVay needed to do it, and he put together a game plan for a John Wolford, and even when Wolford gets hurt, a banged up Jared Goff means. He didn't cut it loose as much and sort of limited him to kind of game management status in some ways. And you saw a better result. Now, what we also saw is Cam Akers being what some of us liked about him as a prospect coming out of school. And we're like, yep, there's that. And suddenly the NFC West looks like 49ers are one thing, but the Rams and the Seahawks still are something to deal with. Had the Cardinals managed to sneak in as the number 7 seed, yeah, it probably would have been one and done, and it probably wouldn't have been all that pretty because there's something about that Saints offense that really gives the Cardinals defense problems. And from, I guess, what we said earlier this year, in general, like a 3-4 attacking front, like what the Cardinals run, like what the Buccaneers run, and if you probably look at it, same as what Chicago runs at that, and it just really causes problems. Now you look on the AFC side of things with the Bills, and you're like, how did the Cardinals beat this team? And mind you, that was a game the Cardinals had control of for most of the game, and then Buffalo got that clutch drive because the Cardinals just couldn't offensively do anything in the fourth quarter and then managed to pull out. So you're like, how did they win that game? Because the Bills were rolling out. Phillip Rivers had a heck of a game. But yeah, it was a fun weekend. And here's the other thing that I really liked. I kind of like having a 7th playoff team and having a wild card, super wild card with 3 games on Saturday and 3 games on Sunday. Yeah, I really liked that.
Yeah, 2 full days is a lot of fun, and it makes it, it makes it an event. You've got basically 9 hours of football from, Arizona time, 11 a.m. until, actually probably more than, probably closer to 10 hours of football time, and it's a lot of fun, and it makes it enjoyable, and it's kind of something to base your days around and really just sit back and relax. Obviously, it was a little easier for us because we didn't have to cover anything, which changes things a little
It
bit.
does.
But
I actually happen to be, listening in the car for most of the weekend as my wife and I took our daughter up to college for the spring semester, and so going up to northern Utah and back, it was spending a lot of time with the phone on. Now, I was driving and I was being safe, but I had it on my TV app, so the game was on my phone like on the TV. But it was a nice way to handle the driving, the 11 hours of driving each way that it ended up being. So, yeah, that was a heck of a lot of fun, and it's interesting the dynamic that you're seeing, at least on the quarterback side of things. But because you've got your in the NFC, you've got your old guys, you've got your legends with Tom Brady and Drew Brees and Aaron Rodgers, and then the Rams. And then you've got the Rams. And in the AFC, obviously you've got Patrick Mahomes, you've got Lamar Jackson, then you've got Josh Allen. So here you've got these young stars, and well, it's in AFC. They're all young studs that you've got, because you've got Baker, you've got Patrick, you've got Lamar, and you've got Josh Allen. And then
well,
in
and
the
I
in,
think
in the
that's
NFC, you've got the legends.
well, and I think that's kind of my favorite little nugget of information is that Baker Mayfield's the oldest quarterback in the AFC playoffs.
Right?
And it's like, wait, wasn't he just the first overall pick 3 years ago? So, it makes it enjoyable, and it's a funny thing. And it's good to see. And somebody tweeted it out. I think it was Justice Mosqueda, and I agree with it. He's like, it's funny that for the first time in forever, the AFC is the more exciting offensive football division or conference. You look at kind of the history and just the way football has been. It's typically been, NFC teams that are a little more wide open and enjoyable may not be the right word, but more fun to watch from that perspective. And so to see it be the AFC now with all these young, talented quarterbacks is, it's definitely a different perspective.
Right. Coming next on the Rise of Sierra podcast, the best of Cardinals talk on the way. Let's move on and start with the Cardinals. We're going to discuss what the biggest questions are for the Cardinals entering this offseason. That's coming next on Rise Up Sea Red. We're back on the Rise Up Sea Red podcast, the best of Cardinals talk on the web. The Cardinals have a number, we could say, as disappointing as it was at the end, overall, it was a step in the right direction. But just like they did at last offseason, they do enter this offseason with a chunk load of questions. And let's talk about those. Seth, for you, what is big question number one as the Cardinals face this coming offseason?
I think the biggest question is, what is their plan in or to help Cliff Kingsbury? It's interesting that I don't know if it was, have they said, I guess they'll probably never say, but who was kind of making the decision to let go of David Ray? And I don't know if Tom Clement necessarily was it was his decision to retire, or if he, was one of those, hey, maybe it's time to retire type of suggestions. And I'm not speculating. I honestly don't know. So that makes it interesting, because is this potentially Cliff saying, hey, I've done it your way. It hasn't worked like we wanted it to. Let me have a chance to do it my way. Because I am interested in that, and what that means for Cliff and his decisions, or what he does next.
For me, one of the big questions, actually, I think the number one question for me entering this offseason isn't so much about what they do handle the coaching staff. We're going to talk a little bit about what the coaching moves, at least the ones reported, have been, and that is how the Cardinals maneuver the cap this offseason. We know the cap is likely going to drop. It might not drop as much as anticipated, because if they get the 17th game set for 2021 with the media kicker, that should alleviate some of the issues and maybe be able to keep it near flat. But nonetheless, the Cardinals, as of right now, are into the offseason in not a great place in the cap. So it's going to be interesting with the fact that we know that they are still a step or two away. After their start of the season and how they ended, it became clear that they were close, but they weren't there yet, and so they do need another step or two forward. And how they're going to manage the cap with the number of needs that they have.
Yeah, and it's interesting because you look at the way that they've built this team. And I mean, this is a long conversation to have. So to try to sum it up, they haven't really built well in terms of contracts. We've talked about Steve Keim's penchant for kicking the can down the road, whether it's Terrell Suggs or Sam Bradford or heck, Devondre Campbell's contract, where there's $4 million on the salary cap next season. And so what are they going to be able to do with these contracts coming up? Because, obviously they're about 25 million right now projected.
Something like that. I haven't looked at the big cap numbers so far, simply because we were going to do that for another show. But it's not ideal, especially with the number of players that they have under contract. Like you counted it up. So they signed 20 guys to future deals, and they have, by my count, 33 guys whose contracts are expiring. So if you just go by the 53 on their roster plus a handful, they're returning 25 to 30 guys from this roster.
Yeah, and so you look at it, and they've got two big decisions to make at hugely expensive positions in Hassan Reddick and Patrick Peterson. And they're also both big time positions of need. So the question becomes, like you said, how do they manipulate and manage and maneuver around those kind of two glaring needs with, not a ton of money to work with?
For me, another big question for the Cardinals is, this is one that we have every year, but I think this is the real one, because I don't think he comes. This will be the first year that I would be honestly surprised if he does return, and that is what the Cardinals look at post Larry Fitzgerald. And honestly, it's going to be odd, because it could be a post Larry Fitzgerald and Patrick Peterson Cardinals team in 2021. But mainly, does Larry come back? But less so, because I think signs point towards his retiring for a number of reasons. They've had that security blanket at quarterback at receiver forever. His numbers were the lowest of his career. He obviously contracted COVID. He missed the last game of the year. That's how hurt he was. You can tell that this kind of felt like, in 2015 and 2014. I'll say more 2014 and 2015, where his legs, he was dinged up at the end of the year, and it really took his toll. And now I didn't since of the COVID protocols, we weren't able to see in the locker room. We weren't able to see just how much it affected his walking around, or how achy he looked or appeared. But what's this team going to look like offensively without Larry Fitzgerald? Because you always, like now with Hopkins, so you have a number one, but with Fitzgerald, you always had a guaranteed solid number two guy. And I know they've tried to move on from him. They know what he could do, and Cliff wants him back, but it means moving on from him. And I mean, that $11.5 million that he costs to bring back every year probably could be used better. But at the same time, looking at that receiver room, even with Larry Fitzgerald, is going to be scary not looking at Larry Fitzgerald in there.
Yeah, and it'll be, one of those situations where I think, it'll be more difficult when it actually finally kind of happens and takes place than anything else. Because, like you said, we're still not sure, but it definitely feels a little different this offseason than it has in off seasons past.
What other questions do you see the Cardinals facing? What major questions this offseason? Not necessarily positions, but big questions facing the team.
I think the last one is, how are or is this truly a make or break year for Cliff and Keim? And that's, I think we'll be able to see some of that based on what they do this offseason and maybe how desperate they are, or based on the moves they make. But, it's been, an interesting way to get here. So how does it kind of finish up is, I guess, my question. Is this, is this the year that they put the pressure on Steve Keim, or is this just another offseason where he's, he knows he's got maybe another year in his back pocket, barring obviously catastrophe where they're, picking first again. But, or is this a team that will, be playing basically for their head coach and their GM throughout the season?
And for me, mine's slightly related to it. It's similar to that. And for me, it is, how do the Cardinals as an organization and as a team with Cliff Kingsbury as coach and Kyler Murray at quarterback handle what now I believe in year 3 of this coaching and this regime, as we like to say. This year should be actual pressure. There are greater expectations this year, and I think entering 2021 it becomes pressure. Not necessarily hot seat pressure, but when Cliff Kingsbury came on, there were few expectations other than, hey, let's be better than the disaster. That even if they didn't improve in wins by much, which they didn't, 2 wins better in 2019, to not look like the dumpster fire like they did in 2018. 2020, there was the expectation of progress. They far exceeded that to start the season, but there was no pressure at all. Now that we've as fans have seen what the team could look like if that 5-2 and 6-3 starts, not only does that up the level of expectation, but since they should have been and arguably should have been a playoff team this year, I think 2021 now comes with pressure. Not necessarily, not just expectations, but the pressure to win, because they were already. Now, I will readily admit that the fans right now who are calling for Cliff Kingsbury to be fired, that's crazy talk, and it's dumb, and it's unfounded based on just the overall look of things. If you look at the big picture. That said, I believe if the Cardinals cannot handle the expectation, because we've seen Arizona sports team crumble in the face of expectations almost every single time there's been any sort of pressure at all. Dating to the Diamondbacks, their 2007 season was fun. Their 2008 season, not good. 2011, it was a surprise. They went to the playoffs. 2012, when they were expected to, not good. The Cardinals, they built up 2015. That was a surprise, especially 2016 when they were talking Super Bowl. And it's just every single time that a team in Arizona seems to have lofty expectations and not just, hey, we believe this is going to be good, but now we expect it and there's pressure to do it, they crumble. And I'm interested to see how this team handles the level of expectation. There was a level of expectation entering this year, but it was more hope than expectation, in my opinion. So that is my other thing. How do they handle the pressure of expectations for 2021?
Well, I think the other thing is, and this can kind of be the end of this topic, but you don't want it to be this way, but it does feel slightly like the Phoenix Suns team, and I can't remember which one it was. It might have been the Earl Watson team, but it could have been the one after that, where they started out that season looking like a team that was going to make the playoffs and fighting for the playoffs and all of that. And then they kind of
probably it.
Okay, and then they stumbled right, down the stretch, and all of a sudden couldn't get out of their own way. And that's the question, and I know you guys wrote about it, is Cliff able to finish? Is he going to be a guy that's able to kind of see it through, or is he the guy that gets you to a spot and then you have to go find the guy to take you to the next step? I think obviously the other thing is you have to be really careful, and I wrote about this for tomorrow, whether it's we're talking about the Suns or whether it's in the NFL. You have to be very careful with, well, you're not meeting expectations, so we're going to let you go, moves, because those can, sometimes being a team that's at 500 is okay while you search for that elusive, final piece. You look at a team like Philadelphia. Obviously, they got it with Doug Peterson, but after they fired Andy Reid, who kind of always seemed to come up a bit short, they battled and fought trying to get back to respectability. You look at the Cincinnati Bengals, and Marvin Lewis had them in the playoffs every couple of years.
Well, and then wasn't it 5 straight years for 4 or 5 years in a row when Andy Dalton first started his career? They just never won it. I mean, they haven't won a playoff game since 1990. But
right, and so you look at it and you go, all right, well, we've got to find the guy that's going to take us to the next step. And it's like, okay, I don't disagree with you, but who is that guy? And have you identified them? You obviously this is a huge, leap, but you need to find the guy that goes from, Bill Parcells to Bill Belichick. Obviously, finding the greatest coach in NFL history is really difficult. But if you're going to move on from a guy, you don't want to move on from Jason Garrett to go to Mike McCarthy and then be a laughingstock. Right?
It worked out for the Cardinals to go from Whisenhunt to Arians, although it was a different situation because Whisenhunt's last year was a disaster. That said, they had been, they took a step up. So Denny Green set the stage, built the foundation for Whisenhunt, who then turned it around. They kind of faltered when they couldn't find the quarterback after Kurt Warner, and then Bruce Arians comes in and then lifts them up. And then, well, we haven't reached, respectability ever since then.
Well, and that's what it is, you know, and I, I'm one of the biggest and loudest guys against, probably against Arians, but I never was, the guy that was saying it's time to move on and fire him because you didn't have a plan in place. And so him retiring was, unfortunate because it's just one of those things. It's you I I get that you look at certain teams and you go, well, they did it, so why can't we? But there is still this idea that it's the Cardinals. And it's not, the Bill Bidwell Cardinals, but there are still some, oh, it's the Arizona Cardinals ideas out there. And I mean, you look at the coaching search when Kingsbury was hired, and a couple of their first choices just flat out said, no thanks, I'm not interested. Mike Munchak, I believe, was one of them. And then Eric Bieniemy of the Kansas City Chiefs. Both of them,
And McCarthy too.
and McCarthy, all of them declined interviews. So it wasn't like, it's not like the Cardinals. I saw today, it was somebody said, you know, stop wasting time, go get Lincoln Riley. Oh, okay, yeah, because it's that simple. Um, you can lure Lincoln Riley, who's one of the 5 highest paid coaches in college football, has basically a job for life, making a ton of money, and is basically a demigod in Oklahoma, to Arizona, who is one of the least successful pro sports franchises in all of North American sports history. Yeah, sure.
And
I'm
the
sure.
change, and let's be honest, there is now coaching in the pros and coaching in college are two very different things. Cliff Kingsbury loves the pros. He is so glad to be out of the college game to deal with boosters and to deal with recruiting. He didn't like any of that. You get the now, but at the same time, the type of control coaches have over players at the college level is not the same type of control you have at the pro level. And someone like Lincoln Riley, who gets the recruits, who gets gobs of money. I mean, think about it. They'd almost have to pay him unless he's dead set on a pro job. You're gonna have to pay him almost John Gruden money to get him away from college.
And in more than John Gruden money, yes, you're correct. But more than John Gruden money, you're going to have to give him John Gruden security. You're going to have to say, hey, we're going to give you 8 years, 80 million or $88 million. Like, oh, we won't fire you for 8 years, because that's the big thing that people don't get in the NFL. I mean, and you and I have kind of poo-pooed this from the start, but we're still talking about it, so it's worth saying. Cliff Kingsbury has improved the Cardinals over his first 2 seasons, and we're legitimately talking about whether or not he deserves to be fired. Now, there's no traction towards it, obviously, and this is just, a podcast, and you and I are having a discussion, but it's still a conversation that's being had. Lincoln Riley's never even, I mean, he doesn't even know what those words mean. And so, again, you're talking about, like, hey, just go get this guy. Oh, okay, yeah, because I mean, you look at Jacksonville. They've got the number 1 pick in the NFL draft. They have the best salary cap situation in the entire NFL, and they have some decent pieces. I wouldn't say that they're, great, but they've got some nice pieces on hand. And they're allegedly talking about $10+ million a year for Urban Meyer, And he's still going, not sure that's what I want to do. Now, I'm not saying the Cardinals are Jacksonville, and I don't mean to insult Jacksonville in any way, shape, or form. But again, this isn't Dallas. This isn't, one of those prime jobs where people just run and are willing to come here. And so unless you're really, really certain you're getting the next Sean McDermott or Sean Payton or one of these, Mike Tomlin types where they're going to be here for a while, I just don't see what the point is of rushing or trying to push this regime out. Like you said, obviously disaster is one thing, but if they continue to improve, even if it's slow, it's at least improvement and it's going in the right direction.
Absolutely. Coming next on the Rise Up See Red podcast, the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. Let's move on. Talk about their biggest needs of the offseason. So we've talked the questions. Now what are the areas in which they need to make their moves this offseason? That's coming up next on Rise Up See Red. We're back on the Rise of See Red podcast, the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. Biggest needs that the Cardinals have. They've got a number of them. Let's start on the offensive side of the ball. Obviously, quarterback, not an issue. And I would dare say they really don't even need to address the backup quarterback. I'm not worried about that. Number one for me has to be, what do they do at receiver? Do they go draft another big guy? Do they sign one? Or do they simply expect more out of Christian Kirk, Keyshawn Johnson, and Andy Isabella? But you can't, especially if Larry Fitzgerald is retiring, you've got to have something better than what they've had behind Hopkins, right?
Yeah, I think that's a big thing, and I think you're right. That's one of the biggest question marks going in this offseason is, what does your receiver room look like heading into 2021? I think if you have one of Kirk or Isabella step up into and turn into a really good 3, potential low end 2, you're fine. And obviously you're not going to cut any of those guys because they're all on rookie deals, and like we said earlier, 33 guys on the roster. You can't afford to cut guys making sub $2 million to go sign veterans for more than $2 million. But what do they do? Where do they go? Is it a draft pick? Is it a potential Robbie Anderson type, where you're willing to pay $10-12 million? Can you get a veteran type like an Emmanuel Sanders? And I'm not saying Emmanuel Sanders, I'm just kind of throwing out names. Player, types, like a Marvin Jones type of player where they're reliable, they're gonna give you more than what you've gotten from the guys you have, and give these and run it back one more time with those guys, assuming obviously Fitz is gone. If Fitz comes back, I think it buys you the opportunity to draft, whether it's day 1 or day 2. Obviously the day 2 picks haven't turned out the way you'd hoped. So maybe you look at day 1, but you can't force anything. I mean, if one of the top guys isn't there, you can't just say, well, we need one, so let's go get one. But, if for some reason that Jalen Waddle, one of the Alabama kids, is there, maybe that's the pick. I haven't really looked at too many other day 1 guys. I know, people have mentioned Rashad Bateman. I know people like Chris Olev from Ohio State as well. So, I mean, there's definitely guys that you can look at, but I think this is a deep enough draft in the wide receiver prospects where if you're comfortable with who, your veteran with a Fitzgerald, you can get a guy on day 2 that maybe answers that call. If you lose Fitzgerald, I think it has to be a priority in free agency, because I don't think you can go in with Hop and then Kirk and Isabella and Johnson. And that's not a shot at those guys. It's just that they haven't done enough.
Yeah, they haven't proven enough to trust them.
But then it also makes it really difficult to bring in a young guy, because that's a lot of pressure on a young receiver, basically saying like, hey, we need you to be the number 2 this season. like that's your role. Good luck. So,
I think it's the running back position is a position of need, and it depends on how they view Chase Edmonds, whether you need to bring back Kenyon Drake, whether you draft a running back high, or if you go with a capable veteran who can produce. So we'll talk more about it. Kind of a guy, I'll throw the name out there. A guy like Carlos Hyde, I think, fits in terms of skill set, production, career, to be a nice 1-2 with Chase Edmonds. Whether they want to bring back Kenyon Drake or not, we'll talk about that on another show. But I think they're going to have to address the running back position, because they use Drake as their bell cow, and now they don't have one unless they're ready to just anoint Chase as that guy.
Well, and I think, obviously we'll learn a little bit more this offseason. But I think if they want to go forward with the kind of lead back philosophy who gets a lot of touches, I do think that they need to put a concerted effort. Obviously, finding a Derrick Henry type is, or a Christian McCaffrey or a Dalvin Cook, those are incredibly difficult things to do. So, I'm just putting names out there. I'm not saying that you have to find that level of a player, but you probably need to find that type of running back who can sustain 250 to 300 touches in a season, and I'm not sure that's Edmonds. I think Edmonds is a very good player that has a lot of potential, but he also has shown that he cannot hold up to the grind of being the lead back. And I think you can't go into a season with him as the lead guy. I think if you bring in a Carlos Hyde, you can get by with him and maybe an Eno Benjamin or Jonathan Ward, as well as Edmonds. But if you're looking for a more complete, every down back, this offseason is probably not the one to find it in free agency, but it could be had in the draft.
How pressing do you see the offensive line this offseason? Because it feels like they're play dip down the stretch. But if you look at the personnel, it looks like they kind of have things lined up. Whether that's Mason Cole at center, Lamont Gilliard, they like Justin Murray. They signed him, and it appears they have him lined up to be starter at right guard. They've still got Justin Pugh. DJ Humphries obviously signed for a while. Kelvin Beachum was great, but with Josh Jones and Marcus Gilbert coming back, Marcus Gilbert will come back after this season, and probably Josh Jones will enter the year as the potential starter. They might give him another year, but I think they planned on him being the starter for 2021, as long as he showed during the year of the practice that what they wanted him to do. So I don't know how much of a pressing need the offensive line is, because I think they kind of have a plan for that. Whether they should upgrade or not, I think they already have a plan in place for it.
Well, and the thing is with the offensive line, and this is literally for every team in the NFL, is you can always improve. The problem is you don't always have that opportunity. And we talked about it. This team, just from a structure standpoint, doesn't have a ton of talent. And so, and I'm not saying they're not a talented team. What I'm saying is they physically don't have a ton of players. Um, so they have some good players, they have some pieces, but they need more players. And so when you're talking about 33 players and 8 of them, I believe, are offensive linemen, that's a large swath. Um, I get that you could cut Justin Pugh and find a, a guy that is probably cheaper and save some money, but
Is he going to be any better at the
right,
but when you combine the new money and the dead money, essentially?
right, and so that's what the question becomes: is is the juice worth the squeeze in getting rid of Pugh for a guy, whether it be a rookie or whatever else. So if you're comfortable with, who do they have there? They have Justin Murray, who you and I think they plan on starting with the money they paid him, and gosh, who's the other guy that they have? They don't have. Max isn't under contract, right?
No. Max
Um,
is going to be a free agent. JR is going to be a free agent. And so they've
oh,
got
they still
Mason
have
Cole and
Mason
Lamont.
Cole.
Yeah, and they've
Yeah,
got Mason Cole. They've got Josh Jones, and Marcus Gilbert comes back on the 1 year deal that he would have had this year.
yeah. So whether it's Gilbert or not Gilbert, Jones or Lamont or Cole, if you feel like one of those guys can be as good as Pugh, then I guess you can cut Pugh, save the money, and then maybe draft a guy to develop. But I think, like you said, Jones is. They think that he's going to be their right tackle. Obviously, we know that they've got DJ Humphries penciled in as their or pinned in as their left tackle for the next 2 years at least. So that's what the question becomes is again, moving on from on the offensive line. As much as we'd all like to say, hey, go get offensive linemen, it's more complicated than that when you look at the rest of the roster.
At tight end, they only have Max Williams coming back in terms of
And
contract.
he's always hurt. He's very very good. I think he's one of the more important players on offense, especially when you look at how bad the run game is when he's not in there.
But at the same
However,
time, you look at it's not a high pressing because the particular skill set that you need for that position, you can get a good blocking guy. You can get them all over the place. They just don't offer that flexibility. And if I don't know how critical the tight end is in the passing game unless you have a guy like Dan Arnold, because it would just give Cliff Kingsbury an excuse to use more Chase Edmonds or more receivers. So I don't consider tight end a need because I don't think it's a position they need to invest a lot of money into or much money into.
yeah, and I would agree with that. I mean, unless you think that a guy like, uh, you know, throwing a name out there, Kyle Pitts, the young tight end from Florida, is a true game breaker. Yeah, I don't see it as a glaring need for this team when they
Defen-
have so many others.
Defensively, I think you have to stare at that cornerback position as you have to do something there because you got Byron Murphy.
Yeah, and I mean, technically you have Robert Alford, and somebody made a great point, and I think it was Andy Kwong, one of the writers for my site, wrote that with Alford, it's actually probably a good idea just to bring him back, to cut him or basically give him the option of like, hey, you're more than welcome to come back, but lowering your salary because you haven't played at all.
Down.
So, but I I mean honestly, it couldn't hurt, right? Because you really, you
He's as
literally,
reliable as say Jonathan Joseph or Dre Kirkpatrick, right?
and you just, it's it's not hyperbole. You literally have nobody else on your roster after Byron Murphy. So, what's the worst that can happen? He gets hurt again. Okay, so if you reduce his salary and give him a vet minimum type of deal, is it really the biggest deal in the world? I don't think so. I think it'd be smart just to have him. Because who knows? Maybe he can play well. Maybe he's healthy for a season, and it helps you while you look for the right fit at corner to go with Murphy.
Right. So honestly, I'm going to say this. Call me crazy. In terms of what they need, now there's a lot of things they can do, but what things that they need, cornerback is basically it. I know you've got the guys like Hassan Reddick and Marcus Golden entering free agency, but I think you've got a good mix of defensive linemen. With Jordan Phillips coming back, you've got the young guys, you got Zach Allen, so you've got some guys. So that I don't think it's a big need at linebacker. You look okay. Like it looks like they're in a good position there. So it's not. It doesn't necessarily mean they need to address it. And the edge you could, but when you return Chandler Jones and Devon Kennard, you feel solid with that starting lineup, especially the way they both with the season started. And at safety, you've got guys that you like there. So in terms of defense, well, you have things you can do, but other than cornerback, I don't see any really pressing needs.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think you could add one more edge player.
You can always do that. That's the thing at that position. You can never
Yeah,
have enough cover guys, and you can never have enough guys that can rush the passer.
I think it also depends on what they end up doing with Dennis Gardeck because he's a restricted free agent. I'm assuming they're going to tender him.
Oh, I don't know. The tendering is that's going to be like $2.5 million. Yeah, maybe they do it, but I go back. Jerron Brown, he tore his ACL on his pre-restricted free agent year. They didn't tender him, but they basically signed him to a like deal. Wait, or did they tender him? Oh, I don't remember. It was one of the two, but it happened to Jerron Brown too. But the thing with Gardeck that sucks is that he's not going to be able to do anything till about mid-season.
Yeah, and so that's the bugaboo with him. And so you kind of look at it, and from a pure need standpoint, like you said, it's really, on this team, it's really two positions. It's corner.
It's corner.
I will say it's probably three positions. It's you need wide receivers. You probably need a running back, like we talked about, and then you need help, and then you need lots of cornerback help.
Oh, here's the other thing. You literally have a need at both kicking positions. No punter and no kicker. You've got Brett Maher. I don't know if you can count it, but I hope he's not the plan for 2021. But you don't have a punter, and you don't know exactly. It's not like you count on Zane Gonzalez. Maybe Zane Gonzalez comes back. I don't think they pay him I don't think you pay him $3 million next year unless it's an unguaranteed type deal. But they don't have they have a young, unproven kicker under contract and have no punter. So that's definitely
that's always interesting when you go into the offseason with no kicking game in place. But like I said, it's a long conversation to have, but they haven't done a great job of setting themselves up for this season, which, the cynic in me says, well, this is, on the GM, but it also makes me wonder if there is maybe a long-term, or they're looking at this as a long-term thing of, well, we knew we were going to turn over in 2020. We had really 2 years of friendly contract for Kyler left, and you kind of move forward with that ideal.
Coming next on the Rise FC Red podcast, the best of our Cardinals talk. We'll bounce back with something that we'll talk about a little bit. We know of 2 potential moves on the coaching staff. What does it mean? That's coming next on Rise FC Red. Back on the Rise FC Red podcast, the best of our Cardinals talk on the web. There are going to be some changes on the coaching staff if these are as reported. Now, I will say, the Cardinals have played a little more coy than did last year. They didn't make any announcements about coaching changes, but some sleuthy reporting done by a number of people in the media here locally noticed, just checking the coaching roster after the season, those guys were gone. The Cardinals don't announce firings or letting goes. They do announce changes. Now, they do of additions or promotions. And we hear these 2 reports. One, that David Rye, receiver coach, who is, interestingly enough, has a connection to Cliff Kingsbury dating back to 2013. Now, Rye had worked in Green Bay as well, where Tom Clement came from. But Tom Clement, who is basically their offensive coordinator without being an offensive coordinator, he was basically the lead offensive coach. Passing game coordinator, quarterbacks coach, has reportedly retired, and David Rye has been released for so however that means, whether they fired him or he was released from his deal to take another job somewhere else, whatever that means they don't have a receivers coach, they don't have their main quarterbacks coach, and Cam Turner is supposedly going to take over as quarterbacks coach, but that obviously now leaves a void at receivers coach. And also kind of opens the door to a potential offensive coordinator. Now, we know that this if there is an offensive coordinator by name, he won't be a play caller. It will be sort of, to Bruce Arians, what he did, Harold Goodwin, who was basically an O-line coach that had the name of offensive coordinators. Because, it's interesting to see what happens with that. I had a guy write about some potential offensive coordinator guys. I don't know what to expect in terms of that. I don't even know if Cliff would go the route of, say, Anthony Lynn, like you suggested, might be a fit in terms of game management, because Cliff's going to call plays. That's his thing. You got to find a guy that can mesh with that, or I either agree with or can balance that out and not be really against that philosophy. Or you could go all in with a guy from college that Cliff would know to help him further. So what direction do you think happens? Do you think he actually hires an offensive coordinator? Sean McVay finally did it this past year when he had the right guy come up. Do you think that the Cardinals end up actually having a guy that's named offensive coordinator this year?
I don't know. I kind of tweeted about it today when the Seahawks fired Brian Schottenheimer. You look at the development of Russell Wilson as a passer under Schottenheimer the last 3 years, and you say, okay, could he help as, the passing game coordinator / quarterback coach for the Cardinals? You would think he would be able to help a little bit with what he did for Russell Wilson. But I'm not sure. Like you, I'm not sure exactly what role Cliff is looking for from this. How much help he's truly looking for. So that's kind of the question: is what is Cliff looking for, and what's he willing to do?
So it's going to be interesting to see that moving forward. I'm kind of interesting to see when things come out. Was Rye the fall guy? Was it a lack of performance that led to his dismissal, especially with his connection? Now, because that's interesting, because if Clement leaves and Rye leaves, that means both of those Green Bay connections, because Rye not only had ties to Cliff, he also had ties to Clement. Interesting to see the direction they go there. And more importantly, does a new receivers coach make a difference in the production and development of these receivers in 2021?
Yeah, and it's interesting because you look at the names Rye has coached, and there's some huge names in there. Obviously, like you said, his time with the Pittsburgh, the Green Bay Packers, um, you know, Devonte Adams and the like, but it just didn't seem like from a developmental standpoint he did a good job. So, like you said, is he going to be the fall guy for whatever the situation is with Cliff, or was there an actual kind of issue with developing guys?
Coming up next on the Rise of Sea Red podcast, the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. Let's move to the final topic. It's going to be a couple of things. So we'll look at some of the names that the Cardinals have signed to futures deals. Any names on there worth noting? And also, let's react to what we saw in the national championship game, Alabama-Ohio State. That's coming up next on Rise of Sea Red. Back on the Rise of Sea Red podcast, the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. And let's look at the Cardinals have signed 20 players to futures deals. 20. That's kind of the norm. If as you look at the names, let me pull those up. There weren't for me there weren't many that stood out, but a couple of them are kind of interesting. Who are the names for the players that you that stood out to you as guys they added? Obviously, there was a bunch of practice squad guys.
I mean, you look at just the names that they added, and you see that it's really like you guys, like we kind of talked about at the beginning, just filling out the roster and kind of getting guys, maybe a longer look of guys that they like. A couple of the guys, obviously, Michael Dogby is back. AJ Richardson, Reggie Walker. I like JoJo Ward, and Chase Whitaker played a little bit. He struggled, but Ian Bunting was an interesting guy that they brought in. Obviously, I'm interested to see. He's a size kind of tight end. So do they see him as a potential guy like Dan Arnold, or do they see him more as a blocking type of guy? And then the final five guys that they brought in, the one guy that caught my eye, gosh, I gotta look at his name.
Sharif Miller was the guy that stood out to me simply because he was a name that came up as a pass rusher coming out of the draft, and just it never panned out in Philadelphia. Although looking at his physical profile, the Cardinals might be a better fit playing in a 3-4. There's a little bit of potential there, I think. Not that you can get too excited over a day 3 pick that hasn't done anything.
Hasn't done.
But
no,
he was productive in college.
Yeah, and the guy I was thinking of was David Perry, the guy that played with the Vikings. He's played for a while. And he's been around for a while in the league, was on the Patriots practice squad. He's put up some numbers in the NFL, including starting 32 games with the Indianapolis Colts.
Yeah.
So I mean, he's a guy that looks like the type that could make the roster and be obviously we're not talking like you said, these are guys that you're kind of throwing Hail Marys for, but Perry looks like a type of guy that could potentially make the roster and be a contributor.
A guy to watch, and this is just a hunch, because he's a guy they brought in training camp. I'm not saying he's going to be a starter, but a guy that could be a rotation, or at least a depth guy, and that would be Coda Martin, a guy they signed off of the Chargers. He was and I think I'm okay to talk about this now. During training camp, he got reps on the second team, and it seemed, and he was on the practice squad all season. They like guys like that, whether they see with a little bit of potential on the interior, like they did with Justin Murray. He's a guy you might see filling a depth role. Super fast guy. He's really small, but the running back that they brought in, they had him on the practice squad earlier. You've got Khalfani Muhammad. He's little and he is fast as well. And you look at some of the other guys that they've got on here. Jojo Ward is obviously Evan Weaver, Michael Dogby. You'd like to see them develop and fill roles. There's a couple of nice stories in there, but yeah, I'm more. Then you've got the kicker, obviously Brett Maher, that they've added. So yeah,
and he really struggled with the Cowboys, right?
he did, and he got some leg. It's going to be interesting to see because when they brought in Zane, he'd had some struggles, and the special teams coach Jeff Rogers, he believed in him, and it paid off at least for a season and a half. But I guess he's kicking. He's thinking it's rough.
Right, exactly. It's tough. I mean, there's a reason the guys that do it stick around for longer than most people stay at one job.
Yeah. Let's talk about now the championship game. So Alabama, Ohio State. There's a lot of guys to get really excited about, and the Cardinals picking number 16 in the draft. You have to figure with the numbers that Devontae Smith put up, is there any chance that he's going to be there for the Cardinals? I mean, the size, maybe.
Only if teams get really worried about that. Other than that, no. I mean, there's just no way. He's one of the cleanest receiver prospects I can remember in the last 10 years. You just look at his movement ability is just otherworldly, but he's a clean route runner, which makes him really difficult to cover. That's the one thing though is will teams be nervous? Because I don't think scared is the right word, but will they be nervous about his size? I mean, he is 170 pounds at 6'1". That's a really lean body type. He's, obviously he got injured in the game. I don't think it's anything serious. So, but I just don't see any way he's available at 16. I think you can move up into the top 10, probably top 7. But the other problem is the positions the Cardinals need the most at 16 are positions that a lot of the teams in front of them need. Let's take Jacksonville off the board. The Jets need wide receivers. The Dolphins need wide receivers. The Falcons, depending on what's going on with Julio, could need a wide receiver. The Bengals could use a wide receiver. The Eagles and the Lions desperately need wide receivers. The Panthers could be losing 2 wide receivers. And then you get to the Broncos. Okay, so maybe the Broncos don't need a wide receiver. And so that's 6 teams in the top 10 that need wide receivers. Then you look at the cornerbacks, the other kind of position, with Patrick Surtain probably being one of the top 2 or 3 guys. A ton of teams need corners. And so is he a guy that's going to be available when it gets to that point? I think the 2 guys on Bama, and maybe 3 if you like the defensive lineman Barmore, who had a really good game, that could be available. One is Jalen Waddle. Waddle's going to be interesting because I think he's actually a better player than Henry Ruggs was coming out, and Ruggs went 12 or 13 last year, I think it was. I know he went to Las Vegas. I just don't know exactly where he went to Las Vegas. So I think he's better than Ruggs. He's almost as fast, if not as fast as Ruggs, which is incredible. So that'll be, something to watch. And then everybody's least favorite first round pick now, apparently, running back, but Najee Harris. Talking with some guys, and we were, kind of comparing Najee's game, and the guy that he reminds me of the most when he runs is Le'Veon Bell. And that prime Le'Veon Bell, where he's got kind of that patience, and he's got the athleticism out of the backfield, catching the ball. He's just a true kind of 3-down back. Right now, he's the guy I've been looking at because, and I just say this because I'm not sure if drafting the 4th wide receiver or the 4th corner, the two, biggest need positions that we talked about going into this, is the way to go. There's going to be some offensive linemen. I'm not sure what everybody thinks of the kid out of USC. I'm not even going to pretend to try to pronounce his name. I'll learn it if I have to. I like the kid out of Texas, but I don't know if he can play on the inside, and I don't know if you're going to draft a tackle. So, it really kind of comes down to who falls to Arizona. If Surtain, just talking about from that game, obviously, if Surtain falls, I think he's an easy selection. He fits kind of what Vance wants to do, and he's got the physicality that Vance has kind of lacked, let's be completely honest, at the position since he took over. Nothing that he can control. And so, I think they would be a good fit. Waddle, sign me up. And then, like I said, I think Najee Harris. On the Ohio State side, I'm a big fan of Wyatt Davis. He didn't have the best game yesterday, but he also was injured. And then he struggled a little bit against Barmore, who's come on strong lately. Barmore kind of reminds me a little bit of Stephon Tuitt, the kid out of Notre Dame who's played really well for Pittsburgh. I don't think he's a guy that's going to be kind of he's not going to be the 8 to 10 sack a year type of guy early in his career, but I think he's got the goods to be a potential kind of Pro Bowl type of guy as his career develops. I mean, you look at Tua in Pittsburgh, and he had 1 sack as a rookie, and then he kind of middled around at 5 sacks a season, but then he had 11 this year in year 7 of his career. So it's sometimes it takes a little bit for these guys to develop, even these Bama prospects who seemingly look like they're ready to be world beaters on day one.
And with that, we will end this edition of the Rise Up Sea Red podcast. We will talk again next week. We'll go more in depth in terms of free agents and needs that the Cardinals might have, and then we can start. Honestly, we can start talking a little bit more about the draft. This will be a fun time moving forward. A little more playoffs. But as we wrap up this edition of the show, that's Seth Cox. I'm Jess Root. Thanks for listening as always. Go Cardinals. We'll be back again next week.
Thanks for listening to the latest edition of the Rise Up Sea Red podcast. Listen to previous episodes and subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher Radio, Audioboom, or many other podcast platforms so shows are delivered directly to your mobile device. Please give the show a 5-star rating and always support the sponsors who support the show. We'll be back soon for the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. Rise up, Red Sea, be Red Sea Red, and of course, Rise Up Sea Red.
Roll!